Hello, I'm Andreia Inamorato, and I am a scientific officer at the Joint Research Center, also known as the JRC. We are the in-house science service of the European Commission, and the research we do here is aimed at policymakers both at the European level and at a member state level. So we do research to support policymaking in Europe. I'm a scientific officer, a research fellow in the Learning and Skills team, and my research mostly focuses on open education. So today I'll briefly present to you the OpenEdu framework, which is a framework that we designed here at the JRC to support educational institutions to open up education. It was designed mostly focusing on higher education for higher education institutions, but it can also be adapted to schools and any other companies or organizations that wish to use the framework. The framework is actually fully presented in this report that we published last year, Opening Up Education, a support framework for higher education institutions. You can easily find it online. In there, you see the whole research process that we carried out. We consulted many experts in Europe and abroad. We did in-house research, and there were a number of other studies building up to the making of this framework. And you can find the full framework in the annex of this report. It's important to say that open education is in the European agenda. It's very important for educational purposes. In 2013, there was a communication called Opening Up Education, in which open education and open educational resources were placed as very important aspects to modernize education in Europe. But it's also a priority out of the 6 new priorities of Education and Training 2020. So open education is indeed something that is really important in the European agenda. So very briefly, I want to tell you how we approached open education. I don't know if you've ever made this experiment, but if you ask anybody what open education means to them, you probably get different answers from different people. So in order to carry out the research and come up with a framework that anybody can understand, we had to have a working definition of open education, which we build up out of our research evidence and also with experts. You see that in this definition that we have, open education is approached in a very broad way. We call it an umbrella term, which accommodates different practices in opening up education. You also see that there is a focus on bridging non-formal and formal learning. It's not only about open educational resources or MOOCs, it's much more. It's about open educational practices and new ways of approaching education using digital technologies. We understand, as I mentioned, that open education goes beyond MOOCs and beyond OER, although many people, when we talk about open education, they mostly think about open educational resources. Open educational resources are very important, and they are seen as a catalyst for open education as much as MOOCs, but they are part of a much broader approach to opening up that can be perceived in different ways. We also noticed throughout our research, which lasted for over 3 years, between 2013 and 2016, working with universities, that most universities do not actually have a strategy on how to approach open education. They have experimental practices, they do it on an ad hoc basis, but open education is not really in the mission of the university or in the mission statement of the university. And our research shows that the universities that have open education as a central aspect, as a central strategy of their mission statement, they actually go much further in the process of opening up. So, in general terms, it's important to be able to have a strategy for opening up within an educational institution so that this strategy can be made transparent and therefore allow for more collaboration opportunities. So you see that collaboration is one of the dimensions of open education, and this is actually one of the most important ones based on transparency of activities, transparency of curriculum, transparency of teaching practices, of content, methodologies, etc. And here is the framework. The framework contains 10 dimensions for open education. What you see now is the visual representation of the framework. So imagine that if you're clicking in each one of these dimensions, you would find a lot of information underneath each of those. They are actually dimensions that interrelate with one another, so they are always interplaying. So let's suppose if you're working with content, if you're trying an open up pedagogy, you're also influencing and working with the other dimensions at the same time. We have here 6 dimensions as the core dimensions, and then in the outwards you have 4 dimensions that we call the transversal dimensions of open education: technology, quality, leadership, and strategy. So, what does the framework look like? As I just mentioned, the core dimensions represent the what of open education. What is it that we want to open up? Do we want to open up content? How are we going to do this? Are we going to do it with license, in the format of a MOOC, in the format of just an online course that anybody can access? Or what is it that we want to open up? For example, pedagogical practices, or open up for collaboration. And then the how. The how is supported by the transversal dimensions. For example, in order to open up for content, you need quality content, you need technology to support the opening up, you need a strategy, and above all, you need leadership. So this framework is actually presented crossing over, interplaying with all these dimensions, explaining to you possibilities and practices that we've come across during our research process that will help you to open up education if you are someone that is responsible for coming up with a strategy for your unity, for your faculty, for your classroom, even for your classroom. Okay, now in each of the dimensions of the OpenEdu framework, you will find the definition of this dimension. We'll find a quick explanation of what it is about, how we thought this was an important dimension to be in the framework. You'll find components, and you find descriptors. These descriptors are examples of practices, examples of ways of opening up education in each of these dimensions. These are all presented in the annex of the report I showed you in the beginning. Just as a matter of an example, a sample of what is in this framework, if we take the content dimension, which is one of the most popular dimensions of open education, for example. So here you'll find, as I mentioned, the definition, the rationale, the components, and in this case we talk about content both in relation of open educational resources, OER, and also in relation to free of charge content, because you realize that in practice, many universities that create and produce and offer MOOCs, for example, some of them have the content available but not necessarily licensed as an OER, as an open educational resources. They are free of charge, but not really an OER. We obviously support the practice of licensing content, but we also understand that opening up the content, even if without a license, is also part of open education. Then, carry on looking at the content dimension. We present the descriptors, as I mentioned before. So then we cross over for strategy. How would, for example, your university or yourself approach a strategy? You would say, for example, my university produces OER, my university supports, encourages teaching staff to produce and to reuse and adapt OER. So there we have many examples of practices in the format of tick the box for the things that you consider important and that your education organization is already doing or is planning to do, so that we can create a final strategy. So the whole goal of this framework is to be a thinking tool that you can think through of all the possible strategies for opening up education in all these 10 dimensions and come up with a strategy of your own, for your own institution. And that's why in the end there is a strategic planning template for you to plan your process of opening up education. And finally, the opening up education has to do with policies, both policies at an institutional level, but policies at national or regional level. So a further study that we are carrying out now, which follows up the OpenEdu framework, is OpenEdu policies, and we are working very closely with member states and ministries of education, science and technology of member states to understand their current approach to open education, whether they have policies, whether they are planning policies, and what is it that they are doing and how they can be supported. Well, this is it for me, and I hope you enjoyed the video and have a look at our report. Thank you.